Hey guys, this is Brian from Fantasy Labs. Thanks for watching the video. Today we're going to break down the Week 4 Millie Maker winning lineup, which we did this last week, and it was kind of a weird lineup with the opposing running backs and Julio in there as well. So this week we had a little more of a conventional lineup, but it still was not without drama. Which kind of leads me to one point I want to make before I start. There's been all sorts of drama and kind of negativity towards DFS, especially this week, and so that's not something that I particularly want to bring up and talk about. I think that there's enough people talking about it and sharing their opinions and being negative about it, and so I kind of want to make this video just about celebrating a user winning, $1 million, which is just kind of a life-changing amount of money. So congrats to him. And we're just going to talk about that, not about the drama, about the Seahawks and the Lions D and whether people should have switched or any of the other drama, but just kind of a celebration of a guy winning with a great lineup. So let's dive into it. So he started off, and this was user Chipotle. And so he started off with Blake Bortles at quarterback at 1% owned. And what I thought this was interesting was not necessarily that Blake Bortles went off or really did anything, because he didn't even get to 20 fantasy points, which is kind of odd that a quarterback would be under 20 fantasy points in winning in a Millie Maker lineup. But I think he was helped in this case by two things. Number one was the fact that really no quarterbacks went off. There were no quarterbacks that made it above 30 fantasy points this week, and I believe Philip Rivers was the highest at 29 points. And I actually looked back in the last 2 years. So last year there were 0 weeks where there was not at least one quarterback above 30 fantasy points. And the year before that, there was only 1 week where there is no one above 30 fantasy points. And so far this year, out of the first 4 weeks, we've had 2 weeks. So half the contests have had no quarterbacks above 30. So I think that has a lot to do with the injuries and with Ben Roethlisberger and a couple of the big name guys, as well as Andrew Luck not performing like we thought he would, and Peyton declining, Drew Brees declining, even though he had a solid week fantasy wise this week. But interesting thing to kind of keep in mind is you're picking quarterbacks the rest of the year that they're not quite as valued as maybe they were in the past. So you can kind of get away with going with one of these lower quarterbacks. So the fact that no one really scored that much at the quarterback spot didn't necessarily hurt him. But I think the thing that made Blake Bortles such a good play not was the fact that it was Bortles or the fact that it was 1%, but it was that it added Allen Hurns to his lineup because he wanted to get that stack. It was interesting that he went with the Bortles Hurns stack instead of the Bortles Allen Robinson stack, and maybe he just did that to be contrarian. Which is great. You have to be very contrarian in a tournament like this with so many people. So I like the idea of doing a very contrarian stack, and it worked out for him. So while Bortles was an okay play, I think it was a great play in the fact that it brought Hurns into his lineup, which obviously worked out. A lot of the top people in the Millie Maker lineup had Hurns as a common play. So he was obviously really important, especially at his low ownership. So great play there with those two. Forte was one of my favorite tournament plays this week. He got a little bit downgraded just because we thought that Cutler was going to be out, and so that they were going to have to rely on him a lot, and that was going to downgrade the passing game. So they were going to run Forte and dump it off to him a bunch. But Cutler ended up playing, but it kind of didn't matter that much for Forte. It's not like he went off for a bunch of TDs or anything. He didn't even score, but he had a solid game, kind of in receptions and rushing yards, where he just had a bunch of yards when you combine them, and that's just what Forte brings. He can do it in both ways. So he was the solid pick, didn't hurt him. Devonta Freeman is a mystery. Like, who knows what's going on with him. 81 reception yards is crazy. But, you know, he has 6 touchdowns, like 350 yards in the last 2 games. It'll be interesting to see what he does this week because he's going against the Redskins, who are pretty stout defensively against the rush. And so I think it might be a Julio bounce back week instead of a Devontae Freeman week for the 3rd week in a row. But, you know, he went back to the well. I thought he might be a little more owned than that just because of the recency bias of last week. But, you know, he went back to the well, and at 16% to get the 3 touchdowns, obviously you had to have him in your lineup in order to be at the top of the standings. Cooper was a very high-owned guy, obviously. And it was interesting because you know, a lot of people were on not only Cooper, but also Latavius Murray and Carr because the thought was that Cutler wasn't going to play, and Oakland was actually 3-point favorites on the road in Chicago, going against a not a great Bears defense, but also an offense with the Bears that's really struggled to move the ball. So you would think that there'd be a lot of punts, a lot of opportunities for Oakland to have an opportunity to score. And that ended up being the case, but it actually didn't really drop down Amari's ownership percentage as much. So I figured some people would move off of him, but they didn't. But he ended up coming through. He didn't have a big game by any means, but got into the end zone. So you know, it didn't hurt him in that regard, especially because his other receivers went off. Hopkins was a great play. Houston plays at the fastest pace in the league in terms of seconds per play. And Hopkins got 22 receptions last week. So they're just targeting the heck out of him. And I think they're going to continue to do that as they work Arian Foster back. They're playing Thursday night this week. So I think that they're going to continue to work Arian Foster slowly back in. Cecil Shorts is officially out. So DeAndre Hopkins is really it as far as, you know, any sort of talent on the Texans roster as far as skill players go, if Foster is limited by any means. So I think he was a great play at only 10%, and I think he'll continue to be a great play as well. I'll be interested to see what his ownership is in Thursday contest, because I think it'll be pretty high, as it should be, and whether people use him. I know a lot of people like the strategy of fading guys in Thursday lineups, but I think Hopkins might be an exception to that case this week, just because of just the crazy amount of volume he's getting. I mean, 22 targets is ridiculous. Allen Hurns, we talked about, just, you know, from out of nowhere, 2.6% owned with that crazy game. Allen Hurns is kind of always good for one game a year. He had one last year, and this was the week this year. So, you know, good for the people who were on him. He was, you know, kind of a good contrarian play with going against not a great Colts team without Andrew Luck. And, you know, a lot of people were probably more on Robinson than Hurns, but, you know, good stack with Bortles to get those, he hit got a bunch of receptions in the PPR. That's nice, and got over 100 points plus the receiving touchdown. So great play on that. Charles Clay was one of the chalkier tight end options. He was the kind of the cheap option, and we thought that the Bills' offense was going to go off. Surprisingly, the Giants' defense has actually been pretty good this year. You know, they've hit double-digit points themselves in scoring defense in 3 of the 4 weeks, and actually held up pretty well. You know, Tyrod and Carlos were obviously the chalk plays, but Clay was all obviously in that as well. So he kind of managed to get off of the Tyrod Carlos ownership rates, which obviously was a big deal because his other players outperformed those guys, but still kept the Clay pick, and he ended up going over 100 yards, and that was big especially with the high number of receptions in the PPR league. So that was important in a week with really bad tight ends. It was really important to hit it. And so, you know, he mixed in some contrarian plays with the chalk play, and I really don't mind. I think it's good to figure out, you know, which positions you need to be chalky in, which positions you need to be contrarian in. And I think just because of how just bad the tight end position was, with no Gronk, and you know, it was worse before we knew that Cutler was going to play and that Martellus Bennett was going to be a viable option. But I think it was smart to go chalky here. And I think he could have gone Bennett, but Charles Clay was, I think, in a similar good spot, but just at a much lower price point, which allowed him to, afford some of the higher guys like Forte, Hopkins, and then this guy Demarius, who didn't have a great game, but again, he's getting guys that are just getting a ton of receptions. So he really just got a ton of volume. So even though it's not like he got a ton of touchdowns to his lineup, and it shows here, like 200 points as a winning DK Millie Maker lineup is incredibly low. That's over 100 points lower than week 3's winning lineup. But it's not about how many points you score compared to 1 week. It's how many points you score compared to everyone in that tournament. And so he did that and won. Seahawks were the chalky play, and he was actually behind going in and needed them to score at least 9 points to win. And I know that there is the drama of the fumble recovery and whether it was a fumble recovery and how they should score that. And again, I'm not going to go into that. But just a great lineup. It was obviously low scoring, but so were all the other lineups. And great job to this user who really hit on some contrarian guys, especially Hearns in the Bortles stack, and just put a really good lineup in and had some drama that he had to sweat and everything. So congrats to him. Life-changing money, $1 million is awesome to see someone take that down. So thanks for watching, and good luck in week 5.